Pearl Harbor, the attack that changed America. The world before the fire. In the early hours of the 20th century's most violent decade, Pearl Harbor existed as a place of deceptive calm, a wide natural basin carved into the southern coast of Oahu, shaped over millennia by volcanic stone and Pacific tides. Its geography alone explained why empires desired it. The harbor curved inward like a protective hand, shielded from open ocean swells, deep enough for battleships, narrow enough to defend. Long before American warships anchored there, Polynesian navigators understood its value, calling it Waimomi, waters of pearl, after the oysters once found in its depths. By the 1940s, the oysters were gone, replaced by steel, concrete, and the architectural confidence of a rising superpower that believed distance itself was a form of defense. The United States Navy had transformed Pearl Harbor into the beating heart of American power in the Pacific. Dry docks cut into coral rock, fuel tanks buried into hillsides, long rows of hangars and barracks arranged with geometric precision. Battleships rested in ordered lines along Ford Island, symbols of industrial might rendered in rivets and armor plate. The harbor's design reflected American assumptions of permanence and control. Wide quays and open decks spoke of a navy that expected warning before war, a nation that believed conflict would always announce itself formally, diplomatically, rationally. This belief would prove fatal. Across the Pacific Ocean, another island nation was reaching the limits of its own geography. Japan, mountainous and resource poor, had spent decades expanding outward to compensate for what it lacked at home. Since the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, Japanese leaders had fused industrial modernity with imperial ambition, building a powerful navy modeled explicitly on Western examples. Tokyo's shipyards produced sleek carriers and fast aircraft, while its military academies taught doctrines shaped by both British naval theory and uniquely Japanese interpretations of honor, sacrifice, and destiny. By the 1930s, Japan had already invaded Manchuria, withdrawn from the League of Nations, and begun a brutal war in China that would claim millions of lives. Each step forward required oil, steel, rubber, materials Japan could not produce in sufficient quantity on its own soil. The United States watched this expansion with growing alarm. American missionaries, businessmen, and diplomats had deep interests in China, and reports of Japanese atrocities filtered steadily into Washington. Yet America itself was a nation divided against intervention. The scars of World War I remained fresh, etched into memorials, cemeteries, and public memory. Congress passed neutrality acts designed to keep the country out of foreign wars, reflecting a population that believed oceans could insulate democracy from global violence. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected president in 1932 amid the Great Depression, understood the fragility of that belief. He also understood politics. Publicly, he spoke the language of neutrality. Privately, he recognized that the world was sliding toward catastrophe and that American isolation could not last forever. Architecture again mirrored intention. In Washington, the White House and Capitol stood as symbols of continuity and constitutional restraint, even as Roosevelt quietly expanded executive power to prepare the nation's industry for potential war. In Tokyo, government ministries clustered near the Imperial Palace, where tradition and modern militarism coexisted uneasily beneath tiled roofs and stone walls. Decision-making increasingly fell into the hands of military leaders who believed Japan's survival depended on decisive, preemptive action. Negotiation to them appeared as weakness dressed in Western language. By 1940, the collision course was unmistakable. Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, aligning itself openly against the Western powers. In response, the United States tightened economic pressure. The most devastating measure came in July 1941, when Washington froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo. For Japan, this was not merely an economic sanction, it was a countdown. Japanese reserves could sustain the military for little more than a year. Without new sources of oil, the empire would grind to a halt, its ships immobilized, its aircraft grounded. The choice confronting Japan's leaders was stark: retreat from China and abandon imperial ambitions, or strike outward to seize the resources of Southeast Asia and neutralize any force capable of stopping them. Pearl Harbor stood at the center of that calculation. American battleships stationed there represented not just military power but political will. As long as the Pacific Fleet remained intact, any Japanese move south toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies risked American intervention. The harbor's very existence challenged Japan's vision of a Pacific empire. In the minds of Japanese naval planners, it became both obstacle and opportunity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, understood America better than most of his peers. He had studied at Harvard, traveled widely in the United States, and admired American industrial capacity. He knew that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. His strategy, therefore, was born of grim realism rather than blind confidence. If war was inevitable, Yamamoto believed, Japan's only hope lay in delivering a shock so profound that it would cripple American morale and force a negotiated settlement. It was a dangerous gamble, one that required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to redefine naval warfare itself. The idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was radical. No nation had ever launched a carrier-based air assault across such vast distances to strike a fortified naval base. The plan demanded new forms of coordination, precise navigation, and pilots trained to attack in shallow waters using specially modified torpedoes. It also demanded faith in the element of surprise, the belief that American complacency would hold until the final moment. In war rooms and planning offices across Japan, maps of the Pacific were spread across tables, red lines tracing routes through storms and silence. The ocean that Americans believed protected them would become the very path of their vulnerability. Meanwhile, life at Pearl Harbor continued with routine confidence. Sailors wrote letters home, attended dances in Honolulu, and lined up for Sunday breakfast in mess halls. The architecture of the base reinforced normalcy: orderly barracks, administrative buildings painted in light colors, open-air structures designed for tropical ease rather than fortress defense. Anti-aircraft guns were present but rarely manned at full readiness. Radar installations were experimental, understaffed, and poorly integrated into command structures. Intelligence warnings, fragmented and ambiguous, failed to coalesce into urgency. The possibility of an attack on Hawaii seemed remote, almost unthinkable, overshadowed by fears of sabotage or assaults in the Philippines. This was the final illusion, that war would arrive logically, incrementally, at the edges of empire rather than its center. As December approached, diplomacy between the United States and Japan continued, even as Japanese carrier strike forces slipped quietly from their home ports under radio silence. On the surface, the Pacific remained calm, its vastness unchanged. Beneath that calm moved history itself, propelled by decisions already made, beyond recall. The stage was set, steel slept at anchor, concrete stood unmoving. Men believed the future would resemble the past. Within days, the harbor's waters would burn, and the architecture of American certainty would collapse in fire and smoke. Sources used: Part 1, Gordon W. Prang, At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor; Ian W. Toll, Pacific Crucible, War at Sea in the Pacific, 1941 to 1942; Ronald H. Spector, Eagle Against the Sun, The American War with Japan; National Archives and Records Administration, U.S., Pearl Harbor Documents; Naval History and Heritage Command, Pearl Harbor Historical Records; John Keegan, The Second World War,